Bernard Hopkins was one of boxing's biggest personalities for nearly 30 years. He fought until 51, made millions, and then almost completely disappeared from the spotlight. But retirement alone doesn't explain why Hopkins became so quiet, or where he actually went. So what happened to him? Let me break it down. December 17, 2016, Inglewood, California. The Forum is packed for a light heavyweight card, and in the main event, a 51-year-old Bernard Hopkins steps through the ropes one more time. His opponent is Joe Smith Jr., a Long Island construction worker with knockout power, and nothing to lose against a legend nearly twice his experience. Nobody in that building expects what's about to happen. By the 8th round, Hopkins is on the ropes, and Smith unloads. Hopkins suffered a knockout loss after being pushed out of the ring in the 8th round. Cameras catch him tumbling over the bottom rope, hitting the ring apron, and landing on the arena floor. It's the kind of image that ends up on every boxing highlight reel for the wrong reasons. It marked the end of an illustrious career, spanning nearly 3 decades. That fall is where most casual fans' memory of Bernard Hopkins stops. One minute he's boxing's ageless wonder, a guy who kept beating the clock decade after decade. The next, he's face down on the concrete, and then he's gone from television screens entirely. Here's the thing that makes this disappearance so strange, though. Bernard Hopkins wasn't just any retired fighter fading into obscurity the way so many boxers do. This was a guy who, right up until that final bell, was still one of the most quoted, most opinionated, most visible men in the sport. He fought at an age when most boxers are coaching youth leagues or working a 9-to-5. He became the oldest world champion in boxing history, a feat he broke twice by winning titles at 46, 48, and 49. That kind of longevity doesn't happen without constant attention, constant cameras, constant headlines. So when a guy who spent 3 decades never missing a microphone suddenly stops turning up on television, in the ring, at press conferences, people notice. And when they don't get answers, they start asking questions. Where is Bernard Hopkins? Why did he pull back? What happened to the man boxing writers called the executioner? And then later, the alien, a fighter who seemed like he might never actually stop. To understand why Hopkins pulled away from the spotlight the way he did, you have to go back much further than that night in Inglewood. You have to understand what the spotlight actually meant to him in the first place. Because for Bernard Hopkins, being seen was never just about fame. It was survival. And once the fighting stopped, the reasons he needed that visibility started disappearing right along with it. Growing up, nobody expected Bernard Hopkins to become boxing royalty, let alone a Hall of Famer whose face would eventually hang in Canastota, New York. Bernard grew up in the Raymond Rosen Housing Project, situated in Philadelphia's most crime-ridden area. By age 11, Hopkins was into petty theft, and within 2 years, he was mugging people and had visited the ER 3 times with stab wounds. That's not a rough patch. That's a childhood built entirely around violence, and it only got worse from there. By the age of 13, he was mugging people and had been stabbed 3 times. And at 17, Hopkins was sentenced to 18 years in Graterford Prison for 9 felonies. 18 years for a teenager. That's the sentence hanging over his head when he walks into one of Pennsylvania's toughest state penitentiaries. Before his boxing career, he was involved in street crime and served time in prison, where he began boxing. Prison is where Bernard Hopkins, the boxer, actually gets built. Not a gym in Philadelphia, not an amateur program, a maximum security cell block. He starts training there, learning the discipline and the patience that would eventually define his fighting style. For the next 30 years, the shoulder rolls, the counters, the refusal to take unnecessary risks. He gets released after serving about 5 years of that sentence, and the story he tells for the rest of his life is that a prison guard warned him he'd be back within a year, like almost everyone else who walked out those gates. Hopkins made it his mission never to prove that guard right. That mission is the whole engine behind everything Bernard Hopkins became. Every title defense, every trash-talking press conference, every fight deep into his 40s, and even his early 50s. It was all part of proving he'd escaped for good. He turned professional in 1988 and fought until 2016. Bernard Hopkins began his professional boxing career on October 11, 1988, after losing his debut, but then winning 22 consecutive fights. That first loss almost derailed everything before it started. But instead of walking away, he strung together over 20 straight wins and started climbing the middleweight rankings. Hopkins' breakthrough moment came in 1994 when he knocked out Simon Brown in the fourth round to win his first world title, the IBF Middleweight Championship. Some records say it was actually 1995 when he captured that vacant belt. Either way, this is the moment Bernard Hopkins, the ex-convict, becomes Bernard Hopkins, the world champion. And then he just doesn't let go of that title. Known for his defensive mastery, discipline, and longevity, he defended the IBF title a record 20 times, 20 defenses. Think about how long that takes in a sport where careers are short and bodies break down fast. That stretch alone put him in boxing's history books. That's the man who eventually landed on that ring apron in Inglewood in 2016. Someone whose entire identity for nearly 3 decades was built on being visible, being active, being undeniable. So when the cameras that followed him for 30 years suddenly went quiet, it wasn't a small transition. It was the removal of the one thing that had defined him since he was a teenager behind bars. And figuring out exactly how that happened means going deeper into the fights, the business decisions, and the moments that slowly pulled Bernard Hopkins further and further from the public eye. To really get why Hopkins' exit from public life felt so jarring, you need to sit with just how loud and how long his career actually was. This wasn't a guy who had one great run and faded. He had multiple careers stacked on top of each other, each one seemingly more improbable than the last. The turning point that made him a household name arrives on September 29, 2001, 18 days after the September 11th attacks, when Hopkins steps into Madison Square Garden to fight Felix Tito Trinidad for the undisputed middleweight championship. In a span of a few minutes on one special night, 18 days after a horrific historic day, Bernard Hopkins went from being on his back in the middle of thousands at Madison Square Garden to being king of the world, standing on the bottom rope and pumping his gloved right fist in the air, evoking an electric, packed crowd to chant, "USA, USA, USA." That win doesn't just make him a champion. It makes him a symbol at a moment when the country needed one. In 2001, he unified the middleweight division by defeating Keith Holmes and Felix Trinidad, becoming the undisputed champion and earning Fighter of the Year honors. He was no longer just a Philadelphia guy with a criminal record turned pro boxer. He was, by every meaningful measure, the best middleweight on the planet and one of the most talked about athletes in the country. He kept adding to that resume against the best available competition. From Felix Trinidad and Oscar de la Hoya to Joe Calzaghe and Roy Jones Jr., Hopkins never ducked a challenge, always choosing legacy over comfort. The De La Hoya fight in September 2004 is a particularly important data point, because it's not just about the win. Bernard Hopkins boxing Oscar de la Hoya during the World Middleweight title match, Las Vegas, September 18, 2004. Hopkins won the bout. That fight also became his single biggest financial windfall as a fighter. His biggest payday came from his 2004 bout with Oscar de la Hoya, which reportedly earned him $10 million. That kind of money, at that stage of his career, changes what's possible for the rest of it. It gives Hopkins leverage options and eventually a seat at the business table rather than just the fighter's side of it. That single fight arguably set up everything that came next in his relationship with Golden Boy Promotions, the very company whose payroll and ownership structure he'd eventually become part of. But before any of that business stuff, there was still a boxer with a chip on his shoulder who wasn't finished proving people wrong. When he finally did lose the middleweight crown to Jermaine Taylor in a split decision in the summer of 2005, most assumed that was the beginning of the end. Turned pro in 1988 and was world middleweight champion for 10 years, completing 20 title defenses, before losing a split decision to Jermaine Taylor, July of 2005, at the age of 40. 40 years old and losing his title looked to most observers like a natural closing chapter. Instead, Hopkins moved up in weight and kept going. He fought Antonio Tarver. He fought Joe Calzaghe. He fought Winky Wright in a chess match of a bout that was more technically impressive than it was entertaining, in a rivalry that also included a notorious weigh-in scuffle that cost him a fine north of $200,000. He kept fighting Roy Jones Jr. in a rematch 17 years after their first meeting. Year after year, opponent after opponent, he refused the easy exit that most boxers eventually take. And then came the stretch that turned Bernard Hopkins from an accomplished former champion into a genuine outlier in sports history. He broke Carlos Monzon's record with his defenses and later moved up to light heavyweight, where he became the oldest world champion in history at age 46 by defeating Jean Pascal in 2011 for the WBC title. He wasn't done. He further claimed the IBF light heavyweight title at age 48 and the WBA title at age 49, unifying belts in the process. Age 49, winning a unification fight in a sport where fighters are often washed up in their mid-30s. This is the run that made the alien nickname stick. The idea that Bernard Hopkins simply wasn't aging like everybody else. Hopkins' longevity in the sport is a result of his disciplined lifestyle, abstaining from alcohol, drugs, and unhealthy food. He maintained peak physical condition throughout his career. No vices, no shortcuts, just an obsessive, almost paranoid commitment to staying ready. By the time he's approaching his 50s, Hopkins isn't just a fighter anymore. He's a curiosity, a walking argument against the idea that boxing chews fighters up and spits them out by 35. Every fight he took past 45 generated a fresh wave of stories, debates, disbelief. That constant churn of headlines is exactly why his sudden quiet after 2016 felt so abrupt. There was no gradual fade for Bernard Hopkins. There was constant, escalating attention, right up until the moment there wasn't. That gap between the noise of his prime and the silence that followed is the real mystery worth digging into. And the answer starts with what actually happened in the ring during his final years, and how the ending played out compared to everything that came before it. Here's something that gets lost when people talk about Bernard Hopkins vanishing. The ending of his in-ring career wasn't sudden. It was long, drawn out, and increasingly uncomfortable to watch, even for people who'd followed him for decades. After that historic run at light heavyweight in his late 40s, Hopkins kept fighting into his 50s, chasing one more record, one more headline, one more proof that Father Time hadn't caught him yet. But the wins started drying up against younger, sharper competition. He lost to Sergey Kovalev. He lost to Andre Ward. These weren't the kind of ugly, one-sided beatings that end careers overnight. Hopkins was competitive, using every bit of his craft to make fights close on the scorecards, even when he was clearly no longer the man dictating the pace. But you could see the gap widening fight by fight. The reflexes that let him slip punches by half an inch for 25 years were shrinking to a quarter inch, then less. The chess match style that frustrated younger, more athletic opponents started giving them just enough openings to win rounds and, eventually, to win convincingly. Then came Joe Smith Jr. and that final night at the Forum. Hopkins' last fight was on December 17, 2016, against Joe Smith Jr., and Hopkins lost by knockout. His full career line closes out at 55-8-2, with 32 knockouts. Hopkins had 67 professional fights, 55 wins, 8 losses, 2 draws, 2 no contests. Being knocked out and physically thrown from the ring at 51 years old isn't a footnote. It's a visual that sticks. It's the kind of ending that gets replayed far more than any of his 20 middleweight title defenses. For a man whose entire identity was built on control, on never being the guy who gets caught off guard, that image was about as far from his brand as it gets. What's interesting is what Hopkins didn't do after that fight. He didn't do a farewell tour. He didn't hold a retirement press conference where he broke down the tape and explained what went wrong. He simply stopped fighting. Hopkins retired in 2016 after 67 fights, with a record of 55 wins, 8 losses and 2 draws. No third act inside the ropes. No rematch clause. Nothing. The book just closed. That silence right after the loss is really the first chapter of what people now call his disappearance. For 3 decades, every stage of Hopkins' career had a soundtrack. Press conferences, trash talk, interviews explaining his next move. After Joe Smith Jr., there wasn't one. He didn't need to fight anymore to prove anything. And for the first time since he was a teenager in Graterford, being seen wasn't the point anymore. That's a strange psychological shift for somebody whose whole method of staying out of trouble, staying disciplined, staying alive in some sense, was built around performance and visibility. Once the fighting stopped, the reason for all that visibility stopped too. He didn't need the cameras to prove he'd changed anymore. The record book already did that. 20 middleweight title defenses does that. Being the oldest man to ever win a world title twice does that. So instead of chasing a media spotlight, the way plenty of retired champions do, commentary gigs, reality shows, a steady stream of guest appearances, Hopkins largely stepped into something quieter: ownership. Today, Hopkins is a minority partner with the boxing and MMA promotion company Golden Boy Promotions. Golden Boy partner and two-time undisputed champion Bernard Hopkins has defied the odds in every way possible. That word minority matters. It tells you exactly why Hopkins wasn't going to be front and center. The way Oscar de la Hoya, the majority owner and public face of the company, would be unified light heavyweight title holder, Bernard Hopkins was holding an approximate 5% stake, while De La Hoya controlled approximately 87% of the company's stock. He had equity. He had a voice in the boardroom, but he wasn't the man whose face was going to be plastered on every fight poster or every promotional press conference going forward. That's a structural reason, not a personal one, for why his public presence dropped off so sharply compared to his fighting days. And that quieter position behind the scenes at Golden Boy is exactly where things get complicated. Because even in that reduced role, Hopkins didn't entirely avoid controversy. He just avoided the kind that comes from throwing punches. The kind waiting for him next came from lawsuits, boardroom fights, and a promotional war that would drag his name through years of legal proceedings most fans never even noticed. If you assumed Bernard Hopkins simply retreated to a beach somewhere after 2016, the actual paper trail says otherwise. He was still deeply entangled in boxing's business side, just in ways that rarely made it onto SportsCenter. Rewind slightly, because this fight actually started well before his final bout with Joe Smith Jr. in 2015. Golden Boy filed a massive lawsuit against Al Haymon, the powerful manager-advisor behind the rival Premier Boxing Champions Series. Oscar de la Hoya's Golden Boy Promotions announced that it had filed a federal lawsuit seeking $300 million against Al Haymon and his various business entities, also suing Waddell and Reed Financial Inc. and its related hedge funds, which are a primary source of some $425 million. Haymon is using to finance his Premier Boxing Champions Series. Former middleweight and light heavyweight champion Bernard Hopkins was a named plaintiff right alongside the company. The allegation was serious. The suit, also brought by Golden Boy minority partner Bernard Hopkins, also alleged that Haymon violated the Ali Act, a federal law that makes it illegal to serve as both a manager, who has a fiduciary duty to a boxer, and a promoter who does not. Hopkins wasn't shy about putting his name and his voice behind that fight either. The Muhammad Ali Act was passed to help fighters avoid the fate that bedeviled so many of our predecessors, and I will do everything in my power to ensure this crucial piece of legislation is upheld and followed. He went further, framing it almost as a personal mission after everything he'd witnessed in 3 decades in the sport, saying that at the age of 50 and after spending most of my adult life in boxing, I thought I'd seen every trick in the book aimed at undermining those who actually step into the ring. The suit dragged through the courts for roughly 2 years, generating headlines mostly in boxing trade press. Rather than mainstream sports media, it ultimately didn't go Golden Boy's way. A federal judge dismissed Golden Boy's lawsuit against Al Haymon. In a January 2017 decision, Judge John F. Walter of the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California granted summary judgment for Haymon Sports and rejected the claims of Golden Boy Promotions, LLC, Golden Boy Promotions, Inc., and Bernard Hopkins. So while casual fans were processing the shock of watching Hopkins get knocked through the ropes at 51, in the background, there was a multi-million-dollar legal fight involving his own name that had just collapsed. That's a very different kind of ending than a boxer simply riding off into the sunset. It's messy, it's legal, and it's the exact kind of story that doesn't translate to highlight reels, which is part of why so many fans never even clocked it as part of his story. That pattern kept repeating over the following years. Golden Boy, the company Hopkins remained a partner in, found itself embroiled in one promotional dispute after another. Battles that put Hopkins' name in headlines periodically, but almost always in a supporting role rather than the lead. When Ryan Garcia clashed publicly with Golden Boy leadership, following his knockout loss to Gervonta Davis, Hopkins found himself pulled into the crossfire simply for defending the company's position. Garcia took issue with some claims made by Bernard Hopkins, one of the key brass at Golden Boy Promotions, ahead of Garcia's upcoming fight. Garcia didn't hold back either, publicly questioning why the promotion would criticize your only superstar fighter right now rather than support him. That's a telling dynamic. Hopkins wasn't the story anymore. He was a spokesperson, getting caught in disputes that were fundamentally about other fighters, other contracts, other grievances. His voice still carried weight in boxing circles, but the cameras and headlines belonged to the current generation of stars: Garcia, Canelo, Ortiz. Years later, Golden Boy would find itself fielding yet another contract lawsuit, this time from Virgil Ortiz Jr., seeking to void his promotional deal entirely. The lawsuit was filed seeking to end the relationship with Golden Boy, Ortiz's promoter, since the beginning of his pro career in 2016. Again, Hopkins' name sits in the background of the company's ongoing turbulence rather than the center of it. This is really the mechanism behind his so-called disappearance. He didn't vanish from boxing. He shifted from being the product to being part of the machinery that manages other people's careers. That's an entirely different kind of visibility. Important, valuable, occasionally lucrative, but nowhere near as camera-ready as fighting Oscar De La Hoya on pay-per-view. And the money kept coming, just quieter and steadier, rather than in massive individual purses. Hopkins' annual income is estimated to be around $2 million, including his earnings from commentary work, his promotion company, and his investment portfolio, though his exact annual income can vary year by year due to the nature of his business ventures. Compare that to Fight Night purses running into 8 figures, and you start to understand why his name simply doesn't dominate headlines the way it used to. As of 2026, Bernard Hopkins' current net worth is estimated to be around $40 million, a figure that takes into account his career earnings, investments, and business ventures. He also picked up small acting credits along the way, appearing in projects tied to his boxing background. He is known for State Property, Blood on the Streets, 2005, In the Company of Kings, 2024, and Golden Boy on ESPN, 2017. None of these were star vehicles. They were the kind of side project a retired athlete takes on for fun or extra income, not a comeback bid for the spotlight. By the mid-2020s, the picture of Bernard Hopkins that emerges isn't a man in hiding. It's a man who traded 30 years of center stage for a quieter seat at the table, one where he still had influence, still had equity, still had a voice, but no longer needed millions of eyes on him every few months to justify his place in the sport. That shift, more than any single incident, explains the years of relative quiet. But it wasn't total silence. There were still moments when Bernard Hopkins stepped back into the light, and those moments tell you everything about what he actually wanted his legacy to look like once the fighting stopped for good. If Bernard Hopkins had truly vanished, none of what happened over the past few years would have been possible. Instead, what you actually find is a man reappearing on his own terms, at moments that meant something to him personally, rather than moments dictated by a fight promoter's calendar. The clearest example came in the fall of 2023, when the city that built him, and once nearly buried him, brought him back into public view on its own terms. The Philadelphia Sports Hall of Fame welcomed Hopkins among its 2023 enshrinees. This wasn't a pay-per-view event or a business dispute. It was Philadelphia formally recognizing a kid from the Raymond Rosen projects who turned a 9-felony rap sheet into a Hall of Fame boxing career. Hopkins, by then in his late 50s, described the recognition in personal terms rather than promotional ones, admitting he was still adjusting to being celebrated rather than just competing. That same year, boxing's highest institutional honor caught up with him too, his amazing 28-year pro career, where he won world titles at middleweight and light heavyweight, finally culminated as a first-ballot Hall of Famer in Canastota. NY. In 2018, he was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame, a significant recognition of his contributions to the sport, though multiple accounts place his formal Hall of Fame class closer to 2023, reflecting how enshrinement and induction ceremonies can trail actual voting by years. Either way, by the mid-2020s, Bernard Hopkins holds boxing's most permanent form of recognition, a plaque, a bust, a spot among the sport's all-time greats that no promoter dispute or contract lawsuit can take away. He also sat for a wave of interviews around this period that gave fans a rare, extended look at how he saw his own story. FightNews.com ran a multi-part conversation with him, positioning it as him finally speaking candidly, rather than staying quiet the way he largely had since 2016. The legendary Bernard Hopkins was about to pick a fight with one of the heavyweights of boxing outside the ring, and he's not holding back. No longer going to sit idly quiet. That framing alone tells you something important. Even boxing media itself had noticed the years of relative silence and treated any extended interview with him as a genuine event. Then came the documentary that arguably did more than anything else to put Hopkins back in front of an audience, beyond hardcore boxing fans. Director Steve Reed's In the Company of Kings is a boxing documentary that drops you into the lives of fighters both well-known, Bernard Hopkins and Larry Holmes, and those who perhaps have been somewhat forgotten, Eddie Mustafa Muhammad and Tim Witherspoon. That project, released in 2024, gave Hopkins a platform to reflect on his career on film, rather than through a press conference microphone, a very different kind of visibility than the one he'd spent decades cultivating as an active fighter. Through all of this, his role at Golden Boy Promotions has remained intact, rather than diminished. Golden Boy partner and two-time undisputed champion Bernard Hopkins has defied the odds in every way possible, with multiple world championship defenses, the first undisputed champion in the four-belt era, and a division record of 20 successful title defenses, proving that it's not how your life story starts, it's how you choose it to end. That's the company's own framing of him today, years after his final fight. Not a forgotten name, but a standing partner whose history is still actively used to lend the promotion credibility. So where does that leave the actual question? Why did Bernard Hopkins seem to disappear? The honest picture is that his visibility didn't get taken away from him. It changed shape, because the thing that generated it changed. For nearly 30 years, staying in the public eye was tied directly to fighting, to stepping into a ring every few months, and proving over and over that a kid who once faced 18 years in prison could keep beating men half his age. Once that stopped, after the knockout loss to Joe Smith Jr. in 2016, the built-in reason for constant headlines disappeared with it. What replaced it was quieter by design. A minority stake in a promotional company, where the spotlight belongs to the current crop of fighters, not the ownership group. Boardroom disputes, and federal lawsuits that move through courtrooms rather than arenas, generating trade press coverage instead of SportsCenter segments, documentary appearances and Hall of Fame ceremonies that happen once every year or two, rather than the relentless fight-by-fight news cycle that defined his active career. None of that means Bernard Hopkins actually went anywhere. He's still a partner at Golden Boy. He still gives interviews when the moment calls for it. He still shows up at industry events, still weighs in on the sport's ongoing promotional wars, still carries the weight of being one of boxing's most respected living figures. What's gone is the specific machinery that made him unmissable for 3 decades. The ring, the fight calendar, the pay-per-view build-ups that forced networks and fans to pay attention on a fixed schedule. There's something fitting about that shift for a man whose entire life story runs on the theme of reinvention. He turned a childhood of violence into boxing discipline. He turned a prison sentence into a Hall of Fame career. And now, in the years since his last fight, he's turned 3 decades of non-stop spotlight into something closer to a legacy managed on his own terms. Visible when he chooses to be, quiet when he doesn't need to be, and never actually gone at all.